Welcome back. I'm Sam Hedden, and I have a very special guest that we will be interviewing today. Her name's Antonia Felix. She's local native to Minnesota. She's an author, educator, and a musician, and I have the pleasure of being able to talk to her. She has 22 books out. She's been on the New York Times Best-Selling list. So obviously you've done some intense research yourself. And when I try to come into these interviews and kind of hope to know something about the person, obviously, beforehand. And I saw that you do research in racial equity in education. And that kind of struck me, and I'm imagine that a lot of the teachers that I've worked with, that'd probably also be something they'd be interested in. Can you tell us a little bit about that research?
Well, there's a fantastic doctoral program at Minnesota State University Mankato, which is most of the coursework and everything is in their Edina campus, which makes it easy for people who live around the metro. But a big focus of their work is on developing school leaders to be racial equity leaders. And it makes them stand apart, and it made it a very interesting new focus for me when I went through that doctoral program. And the project that I set out to do was very specific about leadership and racism. I was combining my background in literature and that whole academic piece with educational leadership. And I used the field of something called poetry therapy, which isn't really limited to just poetry. It's any kind of expressive writing that can be used for therapeutic effect. I thought this is a perfect method for helping women of color who are leading schools as principals, to help them process the daily racial onslaughts that they have to deal with on the job. Wouldn't it be interesting to see if poetry therapy would be effective for them to help them express all of these microaggressions and things that they have to deal with, and discuss that in a close-knit group, and what will come of that? Will that help their leadership? Will that give them a little more confidence, or what will it do for them as school leaders of color? So that's what I did. I created a workshop around that, and I had this small group of Black women principals do this workshop, and it was really fascinating because all the things, all the research I had read about how racism really plays out in all of our institutions in this country, the truth of that was borne out in really everything they wrote and everything they discussed together and everything we talked about in my interviews. So all that issue became crystal clear to me of what they deal with on a day-to-day basis as they're trying to bring racial equity to their buildings. The obstacles that come in their way from many different places to do that kind of work. You can imagine it's very stressful. The job by itself for any principal is stressful. There are so many facets to it. But when you compound that with racial situations, it's a lot. And so that was very interesting and very insightful for me to hear their stories and be able to write about those stories and do that kind of research. And all of the reading, of course, that you do around that when you're doing a big study and learning all about the history of race in this country and critical race theory, how that helps us talk about these things, especially now in a climate of presidential politics, and in a climate of more hate crimes in the last 3 years than we've ever had in the history of this country. Expanding incidences, according to the FBI reports, that this has never been bigger, this problem. This has never been more important to really address, and we see candidates addressing this. And I think that's great for the national conversation, and I hope that that can be a little bit of a silver lining, that we talk about these issues in the debates and as our candidates are interviewed.
Have you ever thought of maybe taking what you learned, making this workshop and all the new knowledge you gained from that, and your knowledge from obviously writing these works, and maybe writing something about that?
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about doing that? Is it something that you might do in the future?
Well, I'm really fortunate in that at the moment I'm co-writing an academic book about principal leadership for racial equity with two of my former professors. They have, Melissa Carell and Candace Raskin, have created and run an institute through Minnesota State University, Mankato, called, well, it's an institute for principals over 2 years to develop their racial equity skills.
Wow.
And of course, they have working principals who are doing this institute. They're white, Asian, Black, Latinx, and it's a groundbreaking, really important work that they're doing. And they've wanted to share their methods, share what they've learned, and share what they do for years, but they just haven't had time. They're working full time as professors and advising doctoral students and running this institute. So once I was finished with my doctorate, they asked me if I would help them finally get this down on paper. And we already have a publisher, Corwin, which is a wonderful educational publisher. So we're working hard on that. But with my own research, aside from that, my goal is to be, I'm developing the same workshop, but for white teachers and white principals.
Nice.
For them to start to uncover their unconscious bias,
Right.
which we know gets into the classroom.
Nope.
And it's, as a white person, I believe that that's my job, is to help white people.
Take that blindfold off.
Take the blindfold off. There's a lot to that. If my workshop for principals of color is helpful for them, they can do that on their own. And they don't, you know, our Black leaders don't have time to be teaching white people about racism.
Right.
That's not their job.
Right.
That's our job.
Right.
And so I've learned, just by presenting my own research, I've learned how far we have to go for white educators to just have a grasp of what is really happening.
Right.
I've been pretty astounded by that. But you know, you're in your own field of research, and you kind of think that, well, this is common knowledge. This has to be common knowledge.
Right. It's
not. It's not at all. So I've kind of had to move back and reposition where I'm starting with some of this stuff, because I realize, well, first people have to understand what's happening every day in their school.
Right.
And
not a lot of people do. A lot of people, their kids go, they come home, that's the end of it. Not a lot of people get that background, like what's actually going on in there. And you're right, giving them that base knowledge is a huge beginning part of it.
it's important work, I think, and there's a lot of good work going on in Minnesota, and I'm sure elsewhere. And individuals, like parents, will figure this out when, say, a parent has adopted a child of color, and their white children have been through the school system, and they've been kind of oblivious to any sort of racial equity work. But then when that student that child of color goes into the system and comes home and talks about what has happened, you know, all of the lights come on and they realize, oh, this is real. And this principal of my school, who's been trying to do all of this equity work and stand up for the kids of color, she's actually been right all this time, and I need to support her now. This is real. So when it hits home personally, of course, that changes everything. But that's not what is happening with the majority of our white parents. But so there's a lot to do. There's a lot of work to do.
A lot of learning, a lot of relearning. Perhaps is a good way to put that.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for viewing. I'm Sam Hedden with producer Andy Watson, and now you know Antonia Felix.
Or you can do it your way first, and then you can do it my way. Shut
up.